Russian police arrested more than 1,300 people protesting the mobilization of reservists to fight in Ukraine. President Putin says he is calling up 300,000 reservists to bolster his forces there. Western leaders say his call-up is a response to Russian losses on the battlefield in a conflict that's been raging much longer than expected.
Vladimir Putin's latest decree is not going unchallenged in Russia. But the state's crackdown is hard nonetheless. A protest monitoring group says mass arrests have been made across the country, including in Moscow.
I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of anything. The most valuable thing that they can take from us is the lives of our children. I won't give them my child's life.
Putin has called the mobilization necessary and urgent. He accused the West of crossing a line by providing sophisticated weapons to Ukraine.
I'd like to remind you that our country also has various weapons of destruction, and in certain aspects even more modern weapons than NATO countries. If there's a threat to the territorial integrity of our country, in order to protect Russia and our people, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal. This is not a bluff.
The announcement has also triggered an apparent exodus of people unwilling to join the conflict. Many of these Russians arriving in Serbia are still fearful of speaking in opposition to the war.
I speak with you and I'm afraid because my government and police can see it and I will have problem in my country. But I want to say freedom for Ukraine. I want to, please, somebody stop Putin.
The prices of one-way flights from Russia has been skyrocketing since Putin's speech. And they're still selling out fast.
Well, for more on this, let's speak to our Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Resheto. He's based in Riga, Latvia now, after DW was forced to leave Russia. Hi, Yuri, good to see you. So what are you hearing today about the dissent in Russia after President Putin's call-up of reservists?
The dissent seems to be widespread across Russia, and people are absolutely nervous. It's said that partial mobilization will affect 300,000 reservists, which is supposed to be just 1.1% of the total number of those who can be called up. But the problem is that most in Russia do not believe in partial mobilization and think that much more men will be called up than announced. Some are trying to leave the country. We just saw it in the report. Plane tickets have skyrocketed. Others go to an advocate. The third will probably try to get fake certificates about any illness in order not to be called up. I've got many friends in Russia who are now living in great fear, even though they have never served in the army.
Yuri, how is state media treating the call-up, and how does their coverage of Putin move public opinion?
Well, of course, the Russian state media leave no doubt that the mobilization in Russia is right and necessary. It's no wonder they are absolutely aligned. Worries about dying at the front are overshadowed by other specific worries, such as what shall I do with my mortgage if I am called up and my employer officially fires me? Or will the reservists be treated financially in the same way as the professional soldiers? Of course, all of this distracts from the real question, will I survive at all, or will I have to die at the front like thousands of other Russian soldiers in recent months? But these questions have been not asked on Russian television so far, but on the streets, where yesterday thousands of people protested.
So, Yuri, we're seeing dissent, we've seen arrests, we've even seen booked-out flights on which many Russians seem to be fleeing the country. Is it likely that there'll be any tangible impact on Putin or the conduct of the war in Ukraine as a result of all this?
It's, Pablo, difficult to say if and how many Russians are going to take to the streets in the next days. Some experts say that this mobilization is at the beginning of the end of Putin's career because the mood in the country can change completely. Others, on the other hand, don't see any mass protests coming because people are totally intimidated. I think that the Russians are just totally disoriented. The war that seemed far away somewhere beyond the borders is now suddenly in their own country, and many who didn't want to know anything about this so-called special operation, many are now directly confronted with the war. As for Putin's plans in Ukraine, I think that with this mobilization he has clearly shown that he has no intention of changing his plans, of ending this war. On the contrary, he is obviously preparing the Russian people for a long war.
Thank you, Yuri. DW's Yuri Roshetto in the Latvian capital, Riga. Thank you. Now to some other stories making headlines around the world. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says the EU will impose more sanctions on Russia. Borrell spoke after an emergency meeting of EU foreign ministers on the sidelines of the UN's General Assembly. The decision comes in response to the Kremlin's order to mobilize reserve troops for the war in Ukraine. Lithuania's government says it will assess every visa application by Russian citizens seeking to avoid military service. There are already exceptions for Russians on humanitarian grounds. Earlier, neighbouring Latvia said it will not issue visas to Russians avoiding mobilization. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has implored the world to punish Russia for its invasion of his country. In a much-anticipated video address on day 2 of the United Nations General Assembly, he also laid out 5 conditions for peace with Russia.
The second day of the United Nations General Assembly, a conference dominated by challenges and crises. Global food shortages, soaring energy prices, the dangers of climate change, all overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. In a rare video address, President Volodymyr Zelensky laid out what he called the Ukrainian peace formula, 5 non-negotiable conditions to end the conflict.
All 5 items of our formula: punishment for aggression, protection of life, restoration of security and territorial integrity, security guarantees, and determination to defend oneself. I rule out that the settlement can happen on a different basis than the Ukrainian peace formula.
But as Ukraine outlined conditions for peace, Russia prepared for escalation. Just hours before the General Assembly gathered, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization of military reservists. In his own pre-recorded address to the nation, he also made veiled threats to defend Russia using nuclear weapons. US President Joe Biden condemned Putin's threats as reckless and called on world leaders to stand against Russia and uphold the principles of the United Nations.
Because if nations can pursue their imperial ambitions without consequences, then we put at risk everything this very institution stands for, everything.
But despite widespread condemnation in the General Assembly, there is little the UN can do in practical terms. As one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Russia holds the power to veto any binding resolutions.
Millions of Ukrainians to flee their homes.
All right, for more, let's speak to Dr. Jade McGlynn, a Russia expert and author who's joining us from the English city of Oxford. Welcome to DW. So, in a speech, Vladimir Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons and said, quote, "It's not a bluff." How seriously do you take this threat?
Well, I think we have to take it a little bit seriously, considering that we are talking about the possibility of nuclear annihilation, which is a very hefty topic indeed to be talking about quite early in the morning, at least in European time. That said, he does tend to resort to nuclear blackmail when Russia is suffering defeats or is not doing well in the war. And the use of nuclear rhetoric has been a long-standing feature of Putin's presidencies, particularly since 2012. And because their nuclear stockpile is one of the remaining ways in which Russia is quite clearly still a superpower, and perhaps especially at a time when the military is not doing as well as they might hope. It's a useful boon for the ego.
Right, well, yesterday you tweeted that Russians marching and fleeing now aren't protesting the killing of Ukrainians, they're protesting that they'll have to kill Ukrainians or be killed by them. So could this motivate enough Russians to stand up to Putin's war?
Yes, I think as a clarification, of course, some Russians are protesting both. I think it's more, what I mean is the act is different. The act of mobilization is not the act of protesting mobilization is not the same as the act of protesting a war against Ukrainians when it doesn't involve you directly. I do think that this is potentially quite a dangerous situation, because ultimately the Russian government relies on removing political agency from people. And so if part of your entire kind of modus operandi, is to remove political agency from people and expect them to just sort of accept things and to stay out of politics, then if you give them political agency, one, they might not like it and they might protest it, even if they're not necessarily against the war, or two, they might like it very much and they might really get a taste for this political agency, and who knows what they might do with that.
Do you see a way that President Putin could ever accept the conditions to end the conflict laid out by President Volodymyr Zelensky?
Sorry, apologies. No, not really. I don't see any situation. And I think as well, even it's very difficult. Volodymyr Zelensky talks about trials, for example, but I don't see of war crimes, but really that seems quite unlikely. What I do think is good is that it helps to kind of broaden the Overton window of what the West might see as acceptable. And of course, Volodymyr Zelensky has every right to ask for those things. And I think really everybody would like to see, well, not everybody, but most people who are supportive of Ukraine would like to see such trials, but they're just not realistic without either the total defeat of Russia, which for the reasons we discussed, i.e. Russia is a nuclear superpower, is not possible, or with Russia's agreement, which I think seems very unlikely, because this isn't just about defeating Putin, but there's an entire mindset that resonates with Putin, and is why Russians not support, but perhaps have acquiesced to the war, at least until now.
Dr. Jade McGlynn in the English city of Oxford, thank you.
Thank you.